Some of you may not be aware that one of the ways my ministry has taken shape over the years is by leading groups of Unitarian Universalists on long walking pilgrimages, like, for instance, on the Camino de Santiago. The Camino, you may know, is one of the world's great ancient pilgrimage routes, beginning in France and stretching some 700 kilometers to the northwest coast of Spain. Every year, thousands of pilgrims from many lands and many faiths, or no faith, walk all or a portion of the Camino. And one of the great gifts of walking the Camino is the people you meet along the way. Not just the folks in your own group, but all the other pilgrims that you pass on the trail or share a lunch with by the side of the trail or meet over dinner at the hostel. It doesn't take long for the conversation to turn to the question of why folks decided to undertake this long and sometimes arduous journey in the first place. Some are struggling with loss. The pilgrimage is for them a way to grieve. Others are facing a major life transition and are hoping to find a new path forward. And still others are seeking some spiritual awakening, some insight. But I'll tell you what, scratch the surface of just about any pilgrim's story, and before long, you'll bump up against the problem of forgiveness. It seems to me that just about everyone on the Camino is struggling to forgive someone or something. A parent, an ex, God, fate. Or hardest of all, maybe they're trying to forgive themselves. And I think what's true on the Camino is probably true for all of us pilgrims making our way along life's journey. If we're honest with ourselves, many of us struggle with forgiveness. Walking the Camino has helped me think of forgiveness itself as a pilgrimage of sorts, a journey. Sure, there are some things that we're ready to forgive, immediately, one and done. But other times it can be a long and difficult journey. And just like with any journey, sometimes the most important step you take is the first step. And that's why I thought I'd share with you this morning a prayer that came across my desk not too long ago. It's a prayer written by South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter, the Reverend Mfo Tutu. The prayer's suggestive title immediately caught my attention. It's called The Prayer Before the Prayer of Forgiveness. And it goes like this. See if it might sound familiar to you. Dear God, I want to be willing to forgive, but I dare not ask for the will to forgive in case you give it to me, and I am not yet ready. I am not yet ready for my heart to soften. I'm not yet ready to be vulnerable again. Not yet ready to see that there is humanity in my tormentor's eyes, or that the one who hurt me may also have cried. I'm at the prayer before the prayer of forgiveness. Not yet ready for the journey, not yet interested in the path. Grant me the will to want to forgive. Grant it to me, not yet, but soon. Wow. That's some honest talk right there, isn't it? The best prayers are always the most honest ones, the ones that truly express our heart's desire. And I wonder if you've ever found yourself uttering a prayer like that one, a prayer that expresses our desire to forgive, our good intention to forgive, but also confesses that honestly, we're not quite there yet. We're thinking about it. We're getting close, but we're not yet ready to forgive. It's the prayer before the prayer of forgiveness. And I just want to pause for a moment and honor that this is a place that we sometimes find ourselves on in the journey toward forgiveness. We want to get there. We really do. We know it's the right thing. And we don't want to be burdened by all this resentment we're holding or the anger or the guilt. We want to let it go. If only for our own health and wholeness, we want to forgive. But not yet. We're not quite there yet. I want to suggest that even this prayer before the prayer of forgiveness, even this is a critical first step in the journey of forgiveness. A declaration of our intention, of our desire, at least, to forgive. You know, friends, if you consider the context out of which this prayer arises, written by Archbishop Tutu, who led the Truth and Reconciliation process and in post-apartheid South Africa, then it's even more remarkable, right? In the wake of the violence of apartheid, to declare oneself open to even the possibility of forgiveness is itself a considerable spiritual achievement. This morning, I invite us to entertain the possibility of forgiveness in our own lives and ask, what steps might we take to move forward on our journey of forgiveness? How do we move from this place of openness and desire to forgive to actually being able to do it? How do we get ready to forgive? I want to say that I think an important early step on the journey toward forgiveness is to simply acknowledge and name the hurt that exists. Name the harm. Either the harm that another has done to you, or if it's yourself that needs forgiving, the harm that you feel you've caused. Name it. This might sound obvious or simple, but one way you can be sure that you'll never forgive someone is if you don't ever consciously admit to yourself that they've hurt you. And it's easy to be in denial when others hurt us, especially those closest to us, because we love them. And I think we've all experienced how we can go, I know I have, how we can go around pretending we don't have a problem with someone, pretending we weren't hurt, while all the while harboring this semi-conscious resentment toward them that shows up in all these weird passive-aggressive ways, right? Someone will ask us, hey, are we good? Are we okay? And we'll say, oh yeah, we're good. Or we'll say to ourselves, it's all good, when it's really not all good. When is it ever all good? Being in denial about the harm, or even unspecific about the harm that's been done, can be a big roadblock in the path to forgiveness. Acknowledging the hurt is a critical step on the journey. And once we've named the hurt, then I think we've got to tend to the hurt. I think it's hard for us to forgive others when our wounds are still open and raw. We preachers have a saying that goes, preach from your scars, not from your wounds. Preach from your scars, not your wounds. Preachers use their own experience of struggle and sorrow to minister to others from the pulpit. But if they preach from those experiences while the wounds are still raw, then the sermon ends up being a form of self-therapy rather than a ministry to others. So we say, preach from your scars, not your wounds. I think the same is true for forgiveness. We forgive from our scars, not from our wounds. If you want to forgive, first tend to that hurt. Take care of yourself. Let the scar tissue build up a little bit. Find the help you need to heal the wound. I was reminded of this lesson recently while listening to a TED Talk given by the Sikh civil rights activist Valerie Kaur. Kaur tells a terrible story of how her uncle was murdered in what turned out to be one of the first documented hate crimes following the terror attacks of 9/11. Kaur's uncle, also a Sikh, Balbir Singh Sodhi, owned a gas station in Mesa, Arizona, and he was planting flowers outside his station the day after 9/11 when a man named Frank Roque drove by and shot and killed him. It was later revealed that on the night of 9/11, Mr. Roque had been heard threatening to take revenge on Muslims. In 2015, 14 years after her uncle's murder, Valerie Kaur and her family did a remarkable thing. They called Frank Roque, her uncle's murderer, who's serving a life sentence in prison, and they offered him their forgiveness. At first, the man appeared to rebuff this gesture, but as the conversation continued, both sides warmed up. And at the end of the conversation, Roque said, "I want you to know from my heart that I'm sorry for what I did. And one day when I go to heaven and to be judged by God, I will ask to see your uncle. And I'll hug him. And I'll ask for his forgiveness." In her TED Talk, Valerie Kaur points out that it took her family 14 years before they were ready to forgive. And that during those intervening years, they loved and cared for one another. They took collective action to prevent future hate crimes against the Sikh community. In other words, they tended to the harm. And once some good scar tissue had formed, they were ready to forgive. So forgive from your scars, not your wounds. So name the hurt, tend to the wound, and then I'd add just one more important step that I think we can take on the journey toward forgiveness. And I'll call that step remembering. Too often we still associate forgiveness with forgetting. That old saying, to forgive is to forget. I think the opposite is true. To forgive is not to forget. To forgive is to remember. One of the lessons that Archbishop Tutu learned from South Africa's truth and reconciliation process was that when people told their story of harm and oppression under apartheid, when they remembered it out loud, it eased their suffering and helped them begin to reconcile. Hurt and grievance are not something you want to keep bottled up inside you. Talking it out, remembering out loud, can sometimes heal the pain. But I think there's another even deeper level of remembering that is required for forgiveness. In order to forgive, we need to remember something about the imperfection and frailty of our shared human condition. A wise but anonymous poet once wrote a poem called "To Forgive is to Remember." Listen to what this poet means by remembering. To forgive is to remember that nobody is perfect. that each of us stumbles when we want so much to stay upright, that each of us says things we wish we had never said, that we can all forget that love is more important than being right. To forgive is to remember, the poet continues, that we are so much more than our mistakes, that we are often more kind and caring, that accepting another's flaws can help us accept our own. To forgive is to remember that the odds are pretty good that we might soon need to be forgiven ourselves, that life sometimes gives us more than we can handle gracefully. And finally, to forgive is to remember that we do have room in our hearts to begin again and again. That's the kind of remembering I'm talking about. Forgiveness requires the kind of remembering that allows us to take a larger perspective, to remember our shared human condition, our imperfection, our animal fear that sometimes causes us to lash out, but to remember also our shared capacity for graciousness and compassion, and yes, forgiveness. So naming the hurt, tending the wound, remembering who we are. These are a few ways that I've learned I can get ready to forgive again. Now, back when I was minister at All Souls Church in Washington, we had a tradition that on the Sunday closest to Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, we would recite together a litany of atonement that's printed in the back of our hymnal. You know that for Jews, of course, Yom Kippur is a time of getting back into right relationship with ourselves, with others, with God. It's often a time of reconciliation and forgiveness. And so the refrain of this litany of atonement says, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. This morning, I'm going to invite us to share this litany together, to read those words together. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. And even if we're not ready to forgive, if we're not ready to begin again in love, then to consider speaking those words as an expression, at least, of our desire or intent to forgive. Just like the prayer before the prayer of forgiveness, right? So let's read this litany together. And if you're watching this morning with another person by your side, you might just consider holding their hand as we recite this litany. If you're by yourself, you might imagine in your mind's eye someone whom you need to forgive, or someone from whom you need forgiveness. Maybe it's someone you'll be seeing around the holiday table this week. I'll ask Andy to clip the responsive reading into the chat. But even if you can't see the text, that's okay. You can just join in the simple but powerful refrain. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. Say it with me once now, just for practice. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. Let's join together now in the litany of atonement. For remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time our fear has made us rigid and inaccessible, we forgive ourselves and each other. we begin again in love. For each time that we have struck out in anger without just cause, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time our greed has blinded us to the needs of others, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For the selfishness which sets us apart and alone, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For losing sight of our unity, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For these and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of our separateness, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. Amen.